Delighted to be here with you this afternoon. Always happy to be on your campus. Know several folks here and actually went through the doctoral program with Chad and Dr. Leatherwood. So it's always good to see familiar faces. So we are going to be talking about implicit bias today. So somebody tell me what they hope to get out of today's session. Somebody.
Just being more aware of when I'm doing it or when I have it.
Okay, good, thank you. See, it pays to participate. So we're going to get started and talk a little bit about implicit bias. So in terms of our instructional objectives today, we will develop some common terminology, because what I have found is when we talk about implicit bias and we talk about microaggressions and several other terms, that individuals have different definitions of what those terms are. And so we're going to look at those. We're going to talk about the foundations of implicit bias, where they come from. And we're going to examine some strategies to reduce those biases, as well as strategies to foster belonging. Because really this whole work is around all people feeling a part of the organization, all people having that inclusive belonging sense of where they work. And I tell folks, you know, after 30 years of teaching and being in the system, when you get to the point where you're just not happy going to work, you probably need to move on. And so we want people to have that, we want to foster that sense of belonging. So I like to have you do a couple things, and we'll go about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and we'll take a 10-minute break because I have a lot of information we're going to try to cover. I'm going to leave some time for us to discuss some things. But when you look at our covenant, I want you to be able to put on a couple hats. I want you to put on the hat of faculty, staff, whatever your role is here at the college, and how important it is to set that tone for not only your co-workers, but also the students. Okay? And then I want you to put on the student's hat, and from that lens, think about how we creating that sense of belonging, so not just between our co-workers, but for the students that are on our campus. So I like to talk about community covenant, and this being a community college, what does that really mean? So when you hear the term community, what does that mean for anybody?
Group of people that come together.
Group of people that come together for a common goal. Okay, you're welcome. And so you can see I like it to be interactive, okay? And one of the things I'm modeling is how do we make people comfortable in the classroom. Faculty, staff, administrators, we're bad about acting just like our students in workshops like this. And so think about that. So how do you make it personable? How do you get to know the people that you're serving here at Blue Ridge? So when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and bias, it's much more than just race-based. So if you take away one thing today, I want you to take away that when we talk about these terms, this is much more than race. And unfortunately, that's usually where we go when we talk about these type of trainings. So this is not your typical training that you may have had by other folks. This is much more a comprehensive approach where we talk about the dominant versus the non-dominant culture. And that will change depending on what program you're talking about. If we're talking about engineering, what's going to be the dominant culture in the engineering program?
White male.
Who?
White male.
White male. And one back there.
I'll answer every one of your questions if you'll take those calories away.
This is a guilt-free zone. Okay, so it's white males and male dominant. So it depends on the program that you're talking about, and that's why I really want you to get away from, think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the terms of just race and ethnicity. That's what the media has fed us. And they feed us that because it sells stories. So when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking much broader than that. There's no silver bullet. We didn't get to where we were overnight. We have a history of organizational culture and organizational climate and our regional climate of where we are that has fostered some of our practices and our procedures. So Rome was not built in a day. We're not going to solve everything in one session. And there's no one right way. If you have a consultant that tells you this is the way you do it and this is the way it's got to be, run. Because it depends on the organizational culture and climate within that organization. And so there's no one way to reach your outcomes. I usually start by saying, what is the outcomes that you want to achieve? And let's get there based on your composition of your faculty, your staff, your administrators, your students, and what do they look like? And what is diversity among those groups? And then speak your truth. Be open, receptive, and respectful while treating people like you want to be treated. So we are filming today, so as you have questions, if you don't feel comfortable sharing them while we are filming, just jot them down, and towards the end we'll stop recording and then you can ask those questions. But if you have one, as we're going along, feel free to just shout it out and we'll tackle it then. Participate at your level of comfort. This is a safe, brave space. And think again with your lens of a student, how do you create that safe, brave space for students? And it's those open conversations. And then change requires doing the work. You got to put in the work. Again, no person can tell you exactly how to do something. You've got to, every situation is different. So the Dalai Lama says we can influence our own families can influence our communities, and our communities can influence our nations. What that means to me is we all have a place to play in diversity, equity, inclusion, and equity. So as we do that, let's talk a little bit, let's listen to this video around what we mean by implicit bias.
What does the neuroscience say about bias? There are two things in particular that happen with bias and the brain. The first thing that happens is that we gravitate to sameness or to likeness. It's called likeness bias or homophily bias, which is to say that when we meet someone, our brain unconsciously in under a second will say to ourselves, is this person like me or not like me? The us, the them, the in-group, the out-group. We do this in under a second, and in fact, in under 120 milliseconds, our brains will categorize the person tied back to race, age, and gender. And we say, is this person like me or not like me? If the person is like me, the brain says, go ahead, be nice, be empathetic, faster than if the person is not like me. If the person is not like me, the unconscious brain says, proceed with caution, proceed with care, proceed with apprehension. And the reason why we do this is because at the end of the day, as humans, we're animals. We have the reptilian brain right here. The reptilian brain's purpose is to keep us safe from harmful stimuli in the environment. If you're like me, the brain says, less likely to harm me. If you're not like me, the brain says, well, could eat me, so I should be careful. So that's the first thing the brain does. The second thing the brain does is it categorizes people based on data that we intake through our senses from the environment. And then we treat people based on these categorizations. So, for example, let's pretend you're talking to a brown woman. Your unconscious brain will clock, I'm talking to a brown woman. It will go to the filing cabinet in the brain that says brown woman on it. It will open up the filing cabinet. Whatever message or meaning you are holding in your filing cabinet in that moment about brown woman will come up, and it's on that basis that we then treat the person. Which is why it's so important for us to be paying attention to what message or meaning are we absorbing in our interaction with the woman, what we're absorbing from the media and society at large, what other people tell us, because what we hold in our filing cabinets, tied back to people's cultural identities, often is incorrect and is riddled with bias, and it's on that basis that we're treating people.
So I wanted to start with that video because a lot of times when we talk about implicit bias, we forget that it's unconscious. And that unconscious behavior that's a result of what we've been taught. And we talk about internalized and externalized. Internalizing meaning that all of the messages that we're getting from external sources, we internalize that and we act based on that internalization of those data points. And so a lot of times it's based on differences. So the one thing I want you to take away from today, the second thing, first is it's not just race. The second is that diversity just equals differences. If you're coming up with a terminology and you're looking at a definition, diversity equals differences. And those differences are not, these are not all of them, but we have individual differences. And so in HR, we talk about the tip of the iceberg, that these are the things that you can generally observe that are different among people. So the culture may be different, the demographic and physical composition. That's one we sometimes don't think about. When we're talking here, we're talking about body shape and weight and those type of characteristics where we may, again, unconsciously treat people that are different than us. So, I tell people I'm beginning to show my age with some of these presentations, but, I remember when we had stewardesses instead of flight attendants, and they were all female. They all had to be a certain size. They all had to have blonde hair, blue eyes, and so based on that, we were treating people differently, not based on their skill sets, but just on their physical attraction. And even in diversity, we talk about folks that are that we deem more attractive get better treatment than folks that are less desirable in their look. And so when you talk about diversity, I want you to take away that it just equals differences, sexual orientation, sexual identity, language. I do a lot of work with healthcare facilities. Their biggest difference is around language, where they may have a working staff that English is not their first language. And so other staff members may treat those people differently and discriminate. I literally was on a client's campus one day, a health facility campus, and was there to do this kind of training and was walking by these two individuals that worked there. And one of the ladies said to the other, "I wish they would speak English." And I thought, "Whoa, please come on here to this training." So it could be language, emotions. A lot of times different culture and emotions, they express themselves differently. They may talk a lot with their hands. They may be a little louder. And a lot of times with our Hispanic Latino students particularly, we may feel threatened by that student. I've worked on 4 or 5 different college campuses in my 30 years of being in education. And one of the disciplinary hearings was a young lady that reported this Hispanic male that threatened her. And so during the disciplinary hearing, I said, "Well, tell us exactly what happened." "Well, he was standing over me." And I said, "Well, were you seated at your desk?" "Well, yes." "Did you offer him a seat?" "No." So fact one, he is standing. But what else happened? So she goes on and she said, "Well, he got a little perturbed because he didn't do the 10% assignment, and so the instructor kicked him out, and he was mad because he had paid his tuition out of his pocket and he wanted reimbursement. And I was telling him he couldn't be reimbursed." I said, "But what did he do that was threatening?" "Well, he raised his voice." And so then the security guard was there, and I said to the security guard, Well, what was the atmosphere when you came on campus into that area? Well, he seemed okay. He was a little irritated that they weren't going to give him his money back, but I didn't see anything threatening. Now, unfortunately, the procedures, they put him in the disciplinary hearings. He went through a whole year of having to check in once a week, not getting into trouble. But a lot of times we're treating people differently without understanding that might be their communication style. Attitudes, behavior, differently able, particularly if it's physical. I did a life coaching with a student before I came down today, and he had a stroke. And he was saying one of his frustrations is that because he limped and his left side is a little drawn up, that people make assumptions about him. And he said, I was in the store the other day and they cheated me. And I said, well, we don't want to say that. They made a mistake. He said, but then they looked at me and they said, well, you can't read anyway. Think about that. He's a college student in an pre-engineering program, think he can read. Okay? But the person got frustrated and he was differently able and they treated him differently. It could be neurodiverse, so somebody on the spectrum. And one of the things I hope that we are beyond is saying low functioning and high functioning. Okay? That within itself is a microaggression. And so what I like to say is when people are neurodiverse, they're on that, I like to think of a palette of painting samples where you've got different colors and different spectrums of color on that color wheel. And so they may be good in math and science, or they may be good in arts and science, but they're just different on that scale of that painting wheel. Education, religious beliefs, political, social, economic status, all of that those are individual differences that a lot of times we forget that we are diverse. It can be the group level of diversity or differences, where we look at coworkers, the group structure, the group leadership, who has the group power, influence, and politics. And then it can be in the organizational level. So all of these differences can combine together where you hesitate that complete person. You got to look at the whole person, the whole organization when you're talking about diversity. And so that's why I said I want you to be able to, number one, walk away today without saying that diversity is much more than just race. It's all of these different things that make up that person. And the biggest area of diversity is gender in most cases. Think about that. So when we talk about understanding diversity and understanding students and co-workers, again, diversity equals differences. And so some of those visual differences are gender, race, body types, etc. But then there's a whole level of invisible differences that we tend to think or not see in our students and our co-workers. You'll be surprised how many co-workers are going through different things that they don't share with their co-workers or students. So it could be family support, whatever that level happens to be or not be. And so we have this preconceived notion that because they're on the campus of Blue Ridge Community College, they have that family support. In one of my lives, I was instructor, management program coordinator at Spartanburg Tech in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I had a student, white female, that every time I did her student advising, I thought, you're not getting a great schedule. But she would want to separate her schedule, spread it out almost all day. So she would look for an 8 o'clock class, and then she would want something that goes into the late afternoon. And I never understood what was going on. And she was an A student, one of my brightest students in the Human Resource Management program. And then one day, another student came running to my office and grabbed me and said, you gotta come now in the parking lot. He's beating her up. And I'm like, who? Beating who up? Did you call campus security? Why did you grab me? But I ran out at the same time trying to find my phone to call campus security, and it was that student. And her husband was mad because she was getting an education. And he was afraid that once she got her 2-year college degree, she was going to leave him, that she was going to outgrow him. And so he had followed her to campus in his car and was physically trying to pull her out of her car to put her in his car to take her back home. And so later, by that time, campus security was there, and because she was one of my advisees, I got involved, and then I realized the reason she was having that schedule for the full day was when she went home, she couldn't do her homework. So she had to schedule hours within her campus life to do her homework, and then a friend of hers took her textbooks home with her, because the first couple of times she took her books home, he threw them away. Okay? And so a lot of times when we're looking at students and coworkers, we don't understand the invisible piece of that diversity, and we make assumptions around those students or those coworkers. And so when we talk about some basic terminology, so you've had diversity. Diversity equals what? I don't know who said it first. I think it was you. Okay? So diversity equals differences. Inclusion is the strategic, intentional, and ongoing engagements with diversity initiative in which non-majority members are empowered and are part of the decision-making process. So think about some of the terms in there. It's strategic, meaning it's got to be broad. It's got to come from the top. It's got to be integrated in everything that you're doing. It's got to be intentional. I'm sure when I was a department chair, I drove my people crazy. Okay? And it was because every time we talked about an issue, I would say, oh, but how does this impact our veterans? How does this impact our immigrant population? How does it impact our female population that are living in battered women's shelter, etc.? And I'm sure by the time I retired, they were happy to see me go, because I would always ask those intentional questions where on the surface it looked like, oh, we're treating everybody the same. Inclusion means you can't treat everybody the same. That we've got to look at each situation and we've got to say, what's going on and how is this going to impact us? Now, if you were a room full of HR people, I do a lot around policies and procedures. Somebody tell me what a typical bereavement policy is. 3 days. Who was it that said 3 days? Oh, I don't know if I can reach way back there. All right, 3 days for who?
Close relatives, like family.
So family, and so the equity lens would come into play and say, okay, first of all, how do we define close parents, close family? So if you're a foster parent with foster children, are you covered? Okay. And we can go on and on with that. If we're talking about 3 days, we get into social economic differences. Can somebody afford to, let's say that someone passed across in their, the other part of the world, can you get a flight that quickly and jump on a plane and not go into debt? First of all, do you even have a credit card to do that? And so the equity part comes in and says, okay, can we look at this policy and can we make sure it's benefiting all our people, all our faculty staff? So can they, if they need more than 3 days, can we tack on personal days? Can we tack on sick days? What do we do to make sure that we're being equitable, not equal? And so when we look at inclusion, it's saying you got to be intentional. You can't just have a policy or procedure or rule or regulation for everybody and say we're being consistent. And I have an HR certification. I was the interim HR personnel director at Haywood Community College for a couple of years. So I get it around the legal aspect of being consistent. Okay? Equity comes along and says, no, you don't want to just be legal. You want to be equitable so that no matter where that person is in their life, they are taking advantage, they can take advantage of the resources that you have in your organization. And so it's ongoing, it's intentional, it's strategic. Notice I use the term non-majority member, okay? I know that people get stuck on labels, and I get that. I try to keep it non-majority and majority. Again, because it will change depending on who you're talking to, okay? Or it may flip-flop. When I got into HR in the early years of my career, it was male dominant. Okay? Think about HR departments now. It has flip-flopped and it's almost all females. Okay? So when we think about terminology, we're beginning to say we're trying not to be politically correct. We're just trying to show respect for everyone. Now, you may hear me say individuals of a darker pigmentation or a darker hue. And a lot of times I'll get questions around that and they'll say, well, why aren't you using people of color? And I usually will say, well, who coined that term? Did you ask people if they want to be called people of color? And aren't you somewhat microaggression in that anybody that has any darker pigmentation, Asian, Native American, Indian, African American, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Spanish, etc., you're grouping them all into that one group. Do they all have the same characteristic? Well, we're just trying to do what's right. Well, ask people what they like to be called. I tend not to use the term indigenous. When you Google that, it was a term the federal government created. Usually, when you're talking to individuals that are first Americans or Native Americans or whatever they identify, a lot of times they will say, I like to be identified by my tribe. Okay? And so we've got to be more intentional when we're trying to look at inclusion. When we're looking at equity, it's a conscious decision-making process of examining policies and procedures, rules, regulations, and practices for all people. Underline that, all people. Where it's to ensure equitable access to information, financial, and procedural resources. So diversity is equal to differences. Inclusion is giving voice to people, letting them be part of the decision making. Equity is coming along and making sure that people have access, is really what equity means, having access to resources. And so, you know, if we are, and I don't know, I didn't take the time to look at like your enrollment procedure. But if students can only enroll by filling out an online application, we're making some assumptions about those particular students. We're making the assumption that they first have access to the technology to be able to get into the system, to get to the website, to get to the application. We're making the assumption that just because they know how to use a smartphone, they know how to navigate the system. We're making a lot of assumptions about our student population without saying what's the challenge of them reaching out. So when I was at AB Tech, we had a lot of students that were veterans, and they lived in the veteran quarters. And a lot of our hybrid courses, they weren't doing as well. And so when we started drilling down to find out why, it was because they had one computer lab in the quarter at that time. They could sign up for a particular time slot. And so they didn't have all these hours to get on, I think we were doing Moodle at that time, to get into Moodle and do their assignments. Or we found that a couple of them were walking to the McDonald's and sitting there to get online. And so equity started making you drill down a little deeper. And then in doing some work for the veteran quarters, realized that with their Stedman house, the house that they have for women, that a lot of times they didn't have access, and they didn't have the labs that were needed. And so when you start thinking about equity, you start saying, what conscious decision making are we doing around making sure that everybody have access? Just because we know how to access it, they may not. And a lot of times organizations, again, I haven't looked at Blue Ridge website or anything, but a lot of times we will put stuff on our website and think people are going to just find it. Or we will have several clicks that they have to do to be able to get to it. And so equity comes along and says, no, no, let's put the lens on as a student. One of the things that I like to do is a space utilization exercise, usually particularly if I'm in a corporate setting and we're looking at organizational climate. And I'll say, okay, we're going to take a tour, and we get up and we walk around. And I'll say, okay, I want you to observe as much as you can as we take this tour. And then we're going to come back and we're going to discuss it from an equitable lens. And so a lot of times we'll come back and I'll say, what did you observe about the walking conditions? And I'll get, oh, it was okay. Well, what if you were blind? What if you were physically challenged? What if you were in a wheelchair? And so that start opening the lens to say, are we doing a good job? And where that came from, I can't claim to have come up with that. When I was at teaching at Spartanburg Tech, we were a satellite campus for the South Carolina Blind and Deaf Schools. And so we had a lot of students that we had to adapt our classes, etc. And so we, once a year, actually once a semester, we would take a tour, walking tour of the campus and the classrooms. And we would put ourselves in the shoes of our students. And one of my students actually was blind. And I remember him taking an accounting class, and we had to go to the shop classroom, and they made it looked like a checkerboard, where it had rows and columns, where he could feel, as the instructor was talking about debits and columns and credits and columns, he was able to follow along with that tool. But the one thing he said to me one day, he said, well, you all think you all do such a good job. And I said, Tony, what are you talking about? He said, well, you know, I got smacked in the head this morning. And I looked at him and I said, well, my first thought was, who? I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I had my cane, I'm walking on the sidewalk. And he said, yeah, y'all did a good job clearing the brush along the sides of the sidewalk, but you didn't think about the overhang. And he said, I was on the end, and I was close to the end, and as I'm walking, I hit a branch that was low hanging. So even when you try your best around equity and access to everything, you can't see everything. What I like to say is, think about it like as a parent, a new parent with a newborn. They tell you to get down on the floor and do what? Crawl around. Crawl around like you're the baby. Because you then begin to see things through a different lens that you don't see as an able-bodied person walking around. And so that's really what we're talking about when we say equity. It's not race-based. It's making sure that everybody has access to everything that they need to thrive and be successful. And so when we start looking at equity and belonging, what we look at is equity is all about being fair, the fairness in the organization. So asking ourselves, is it fair? Not is it consistent, but is it fair? It's leveling the playing field. It's leveling the playing field. And so at one of the colleges I was at, my siblings teased me about I've changed jobs every 4 years for the first few years of my college teaching. And I said it was strategic. And my brother, my older brother, looked at me and he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You're still working. I'm retired." And he looked at me like, "What?" And I said, "The state system, when you first come in, particularly right out of college, you have 0 teaching experience. So your base pay is way down here. And then if you stay somewhere," and I'm not advocating for you to leave Blue Ridge. I don't want your president or HR people calling me. This was my journey. But I stayed at my first teaching job for 4 years, and then I changed colleges within the same system. Now I have 4 years of experience. My base salary, which pay raises, longevity, etc., is based on your pay, jumped. I stayed there 4 years, changed colleges. Now I have 8 years. Now I did that 3 or 4 times before I settled at AB Tech, where I ultimately took early retirement. But it was because I understood how to level the playing field. Okay? And so when we're talking about equity, that's what we're trying to do with our students and our co-workers. We're leveling the playing field. Consistent access to resources. Okay? Making sure we don't just post stuff, that people have access, they know where to look. If we're a faculty member, making sure it's clear on our course syllabi, our policies, our procedures, links to websites, the college websites. I'm doing some consulting right now with an educational group where we're trying to make sure that students and faculty and staff have everything they need to be successful. And so we were drilling down to the classroom section, and I said, well, have you done an orientation for your faculty around what links need to be on their syllabus that a student can click on and it takes them right to the tutoring center, or it takes them right to the writing center, or it takes them wherever you need to send them versus just telling them about it. Okay? And so being intentional around that. Consistent ability to participate. So again, looking at our co-workers, our faculty, our staff, our students, do they have the consistent ability to participate, or are we just putting everything on the website or whatever the source may be? Sense of belonging of all team members is really what we're trying to create. We're trying to create, when we talk about DEIB, we're talking about creating that environment where everybody can thrive. A lot of times I will do workshops like this and people will say, we're not real diverse. And I'll say, tell me about that. What does that look like? What do you mean you're not diverse? Well, we all look the same. I said, really? I'm seeing older people. I'm seeing younger people. I'm seeing people that probably have different religious backgrounds, different political backgrounds, maybe be different geographic regions. Okay? One of my best instructors was getting rated low by her students consistently in students' evaluations. And I couldn't understand why. And so I popped into her classroom a couple times and just observed. Well, we're in the South. And she kept saying, well, when I lived up north, how do you think the students took that? Okay? They had a perception that she was saying because she was from the north, that they did everything better, that they knew how to do it better, that they were better at it, that they were smarter, and the students in the South were dumb. And so they were consistently marking her down. And I finally said, Sandy, do you know how many times you referred to when you lived up north? Oh, a couple times. I said, well, I was only in there 25 minutes, and I marked down 5 or 6 times you made that comment. And I said, so think about the perception you're creating in that classroom with students that don't have that background. The other thing, she had been a business owner, and it was an entrepreneurship class. And so there were some things where they felt like she was saying that they didn't know what they were doing to be entrepreneur students. And so once she changed that and was conscious of it, her student evaluations went up. So that was just based on geographic mentioning. Environment in which all team members can thrive. Now, again, if we had time to do a deeper dive, I would split you into groups and ask you to define what that means. What do we mean by thrive? Okay? Because different people have different terminology, definition. Environment in which all team members are valued for their unique contributions and attributes. That's what we're talking about when we talk about equity and belonging. Did you see anything in there about race and ethnicity? No. But that's usually where we go when we think about these type of trainings. So again, my hope is you will understand and walk out with a much broader understanding of what we mean by diversity. And so when we get into defining bias and biases, bias is an unfair belief about a group of people that you are not aware of and that affects your behavior. I love that definition. It does not mean, it doesn't say anything about race. It doesn't say anything about gender. It doesn't say anything about age. It doesn't say anything about religion. And the list goes on and on. It is an unfair belief of a group of people about another group. So it's putting one group against another group. In organizational behavior, we call that in-group theory. In-group theory says, as the opening video says, we treat people that are like us, that are similar to us, we treat them better than people that are other. So it's us and others, us and them. That's where that comes from. You may have even heard the term the queen bee syndrome. What's the queen bee syndrome? Anybody know the queen bee syndrome? No? Hey, it was a term that came part of when we were talking about the glass ceiling. What's the glass ceiling? Who? Of women. Of women. Okay, of women. And so the hey, I don't do healthy snacks. But it was part of the bias that came along that said women could only do certain things and should be at a certain level. And it created competition within the female category. So if there was an open position, scarce resources, that sometimes women in the same department would sabotage each other because there was only room for one to rise up. And so that became known as, it's called a couple things. The most common term is called the queen bee syndrome, where women sometimes are their worst co-workers when you're looking at upward mobility. And so bias, this definition comes from Oxford Learning Online Dictionary. It's just said unfair group treatment of one group over another group. That's where we want you to be able to go to think about how we're doing that. It's the negative evaluation of one group and its members related to another. It is unconscious. And so a study on bias and health disparities says, where do we go from here? That study talks a little bit more around the health responses of bias, that particularly in women, that you have a higher level of stress, that your blood pressure tends to be higher, you tend to self-medicate more because you are experiencing microaggressions. What's microaggression? What's the term microaggression?
When someone says something that is in, if I thought you were looking at somebody else was going to answer. It was offensive or attacks your character or something like that, but it's subconscious and yeah.
Yeah, so it's the day-to-day put-downs, slights, that left-hand compliments that we give people on a daily basis. And so the study goes along to say in most cases it's unbiased, it's unconscious, in some cases it's not. There are different levels of microaggressions. And women, particularly in the workplace, face it more than men. Why? Why? Why would women face it more than men in the workplace?
Well, if there's misogyny and the queen bee syndrome, then it's from everyone.
It's from everyone, right. And our culture was built on what?
Patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so it was based on women place, it's in the home, raising children, they shouldn't be in the workplace. That became the culture at one point, okay? And because of that, when we started having more and more women in the workplace, they started having this unconscious bias. And if this was an HR presentation, strictly HR, we would even talk about those early job descriptions. Those early job descriptions were intentional in leaving women out of the workplace. So we put in qualifications around height, that they had to be a certain height to do this job. Industrial Revolution, textiles, mills, etc. Or they had to have the ability to lift a certain amount of weight. And then we legislated that with some unfair employment laws that were against women. But that's a different workshop, okay? Different talk show. It's unconscious, it's uncontrollable. A lot of times I'll get a question about why is it uncontrollable? It's uncontrollable because you don't even realize you're doing it. That this is how we have done it for so long. This is the general practice that we don't question why we're doing it. And it can lead to microaggressions, so slight put downs that we have. So it's almost 10 till, let's take a 10-minute break. All right, folks, we're going to pull you back, and I'm going to have to pick up speed. I'm an old instructor, so I tend to prepare much more than I normally can cover. But I wanted us to have a really solid base and foundation before we get into some of the strategies. Because I've been doing these type of workshops for probably over 30 years. In my early teaching years, it was really EEO compliance and diversity audits, etc. And so what I found in those early years were that most people didn't have a good foundation of understanding the terminology. So I usually spend a lot of time there. So as we started looking at how do we eliminate those barriers, we start with self. And we say, what's my personal biases? And we all have biases. We tend to try to say, oh no, I treat everybody the same. First of all, that's a microaggression because we're not valuing their uniqueness. Okay? But as long as I've been doing this and hiring people, my bias came out military. My older sister is retired captain in the Air Force, and she is very much by the book. And I was looking at adjunct resumes one day, and I came across a retired colonel, and I thought, oh gosh, no, he won't fit. And then I thought, oh, bias, okay? Personal bias based on my experience with my sister. I'm the type of person that I buy my niece a bike, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to try to put it together. She's going to sit down, this actually happened. she just sat down and she said, move. And she took the paper out and she put everything in the piles like they tell you to do, and an hour later she had it together. Okay? I probably would still be working on it. So we all have personal biases. What biases are observable in our organizations? And that may be stuff like titles and signage that we have. But what are those observable? What is the desired level of our DEIB change within the organization? So within departments, within divisions, within your spheres of influence, what is it you're hoping to accomplish with these type of workshops? And then what's your sphere of influence to be the change agents? What do you have power over? What do you have decision making over? I always tell people, start small and grow it outward. And so it may be that you're just looking at gender and you're saying, okay, how do we make our female students, our female co-workers, etc., feel more as if they belong with us? But start somewhere. And so when we start looking at implicit system biases, It's unconscious. It's built into the system. Okay? And let me just stop there and say, a lot of times you hear that term, system bias. Systems are the individual parts that make up the whole. We hear that term a lot, but what does that really mean? It means that if we're working in enrollment, it's every piece that we do in enrollment. If we work in marketing, it's everything that we're doing in marketing. And so a lot of times I will tell, when I'm doing an audit for an organization or a college, I'll say flow chart it. I'm an old school, pull out that flip chart and show me what your process is for enrollment from start to finish. If I'm a new potential student wanting to come to Blue Ridge, what's my first step? Who do I interact with? What's the policies, procedures behind that? What's the procedure for that? And how accessible is that to everybody that we're trying to reach? If I'm in HR and we're hiring somebody new, what's that process of advertising that job and the initial screening and who's involved and what training do they have around even that non-biased selection of screening people for the selection committee. So flow charting all that to say, do we have any unconscious bias in there that we're not even aware of? One that we still do is level of experience, years of experience, okay? Think about that. Almost every organization that I do training for, within their hiring, they talk about years of experience. Now, as a department chair, I used to say, so you're telling me I can't hire one of my I did some adjuncting for Western Carolina and Montreat in their MBA program. Like, I've observed this student. This student knows how to communicate. They did some student teaching, but because they don't have 3 years of community college experience, I can't hire them. And they know the technology, and they at that age where they interact well with the students. Well, that's how we've always done it. Well, let's change that. What do we mean by years of experience? First of all, where did that years of experience come from? It came from the Industrial Revolution, plants and factories, when we had quality control people that walked around behind people doing a task, and they would look at how long it took them to do a task. And the theory was the longer that they did that task, the better they got at it. In the HR world, we kept that without really realizing where it came from. And so we are eliminating qualified people without realizing that we're doing it. Within the system, it's unconscious, it's involuntary. It's unconscious predisposition, the way we think about stuff. And our behavior may be misaligned with our intentions. Our intentions may be, we're trying to be consistent and equal, but it's not consistent. When in the early days of teaching management and leadership classes, we talked about why there were a lack of female CEOs in the United States. Well, it's because we had all these biases of them being in the workplace, and then when we finally said, oh, okay, we'll have to let them in, we then excluded them from leadership training programs. Well, if we eliminated them from training programs, but then we made a requirement that they had to have X number of professional development in leadership, they didn't have access to get it, therefore they couldn't rise up. And so it's the predisposition, it's the intentions may be misaligned, misguided based on past experience. This is how we've always done it. Yeah, but that's the most efficient way. And it's unconscious stereotyping. So it leads to assumptions. Assumptions about experience, about background and education, about gender, race, etc. Assumptions about abilities or what people can do. We make assumptions based on the music people listen to, the clothes they wear, movies, what they eat, the language they speak. All those things become our culture. And we start treating people based on how we've been taught that. Okay? I worked for an organization called NC Real for a number of years. At the time, they were in 88 of the 100 counties in North Carolina. I have been in all 100 counties of North Carolina promoting entrepreneurship curriculum and education. And I can tell you within each county, there are different perceptions and the way they interact with each other. So we want to get away from those isms. And that's what we mean around equity, moving away from all of those isms, whatever those isms may be, sexism, ageism, classism. I was doing a presentation recently for a nonprofit I do some work with, volunteer work with, and one of the guys that looked like me said, well, but you're from you're elite. And I said, and what makes me elite? I said, you don't know anything about me. I said, in fact, I'm from a single parent. My mother only had a high school degree. She had enough motivation that her kids were going to go to college. I said, but we were dirt poor. And I said, and I paid my way through all my degrees. And I have worked as an orderly, so I'm telling you how old I am in terms of what we used to call them. I've dug dishes, I've worked on top of roofs. I'm like, so I feel like I deserve where I'm at now. But for you to call me elite without you knowing anything about me, that's an ism. And he just kind of looked at me like, oh, okay. So racism, heterosexism, or homophobia, sizeism. We still have that issue around size and what people should weigh and look like. And ableism, where someone may have we were talking about someone that's blind. They don't want you to grab them and try to help them. If they need your help, they'll ask for their help. Or they will say, please, hey, put out your arm and let me guide myself. But we have that savior complex where we want to run in and save everybody. Okay? I do a lot of work with nonprofits, and that's one of the first things I'll say is, you're a good organization, but have you asked the people that you're trying to serve what their needs are, what they want, and what does that look like? Okay? Or we're coming in as the power dynamic to say, we know better what you need in your community, and we're going to solve it for you, which we do quite a bit. So examples of biases, affinity bias, feeling a connection to somebody, us and them, in-group theory. Perception bias, where we are stereotyping based on a common stereotype. The halo effect, projecting positive qualities onto people without knowing them. Okay? I know when to use my degree. If I'm in New York visiting family and I'm trying to get reservations at a restaurant, I will say, this is Dr. Joseph Fox. And the assumptions that people make, first of all, they make the assumptions it's an MD. Then the second assumption is if it's an MD, must have some money. The third assumption is, and he's going to tip well. None of that's true. But the halo effect, or confirmation bias, looking to confirm our own opinions and pre-existing ideas. So different types of biases. So where that came from, the dominant culture, okay? When we talk about the dominant culture in the U.S., it's male-based. It's not race-based. Race intersect that in our early days, but it was really more gender and wealth, okay? So until the 19th century, the 1800s, women were effectively barred from higher education. Okay? Think about that. That's not that long ago. 19th century women had two routes in higher ed. They could enroll in either co-ed dorms or college, teachers' college. The 1865, with the end of civil rights, we started seeing the Freedmen Bureau and the missionaries, where we started saying, okay, we've started letting women get into teachers' college where they can be a teacher, a reception, or a nurse. I guess we'll let people with darker pigmentation into schools. And so really that grew out of the Freedmen Bureau and the American Missionary Association. In Raleigh, we started having the St. Augustine Normal College in Raleigh to train black teachers. In 1901, we had the literacy test that said, oh, if you can't read, write, you can't get an education. Not in 1954, only 69 years ago, we had Brown versus Board of Education that said segregated schools were not equal. Okay? Only 69 years ago. Think about that. That's not that long ago, and then we wonder why we're still struggling with equity. Okay? 1979, North Carolina introduced an educator's certification. Saw a big drop in black educators, and that was from a workshop that was done at UNC Asheville a few years back, about 3 years ago. It goes on and on about education in North Carolina. But I wanted to give you that just kind of as a backdrop to understand in the educational arena, we've had female students, we've had female co-workers that have said, you don't belong here, you don't fit in. And so now we are saying, oh no, everybody's equal. Everybody should be here. Well, we got to undo policies, procedures that were not equitable. They may have been equal and consistent, but they weren't equitable. Okay? So educational biases. We have gender bias, which is one of the biggest one. Assumptions made about aptitude based on gender. And the way that looks is a lot of times in classroom, we call on the male students before we call on the female students. And it may be unconscious, but that's why we're here today to say these things are unconscious. We need to be more familiar with them. They can be cultural bias based on culture, social, economic. We make certain assumptions about people based on their economic status. Or we may include something like a scientific calculator that may cost a couple $100, and we're only going to use it once in class. And that student is trying to struggle between, my medicine, my rent, my food, and now we got something that's another challenge for them, which is an actual example. I had an economic instructor that was requiring a scientific calculator, and I said, how often are you using it? How many people actually have access to it? How much does it cost? And I said, okay, well, if you're going to continue to require it, then we're going to buy, as in our department, X number of those that then students can use while they're in your class. So it doesn't mean that we got to take it away. We just look at other ways to make it more equitable for all students. Those students didn't want to say, I don't have the money to buy the calculator. So they just did without and failed that part of the test. Okay? We had nursing students that were getting marked down on the point system for showing up for clinicals in the wrong outfit, the wrong uniform. They didn't want to say, I live in public housing, and we only have one washer dryer in the basement, and I can't wash my uniforms every day to show up in clinical. So you have to dig a little deeper around understanding it. And so it has an impact on marginalized groups, unequal performance standards in the classroom, harsher disciplinary procedures, and alienating people in the classroom. So our guiding questions that we should be looking at. And again, you will have access to this PowerPoint, and I'm not sure what we're going to do with the video, but that stays with you all. So, you don't have to jot down everything. But what is the overall intent of the practice, policy, and or procedure? If I was coming in to do an audit, that's kind of where I started. I started looking at policies, procedures, and I'll say, what's the intent? What's the purpose? What's the outcome behind why we are requiring this? And then I put the equity lens on to say, well, how does it impact your student body or your faculty, your staff? Okay? A lot of times we think about these issues only from a student point of view, but these are our co-workers' issues too. If you are not given good internal customer service, you can't give good external customer service. Think about that. How accessible is the information to students, staff, and faculty? Where is it stored? or displayed? How is it assessed? How are changes communicated to people? What practices, policies, and procedures have the largest impact on students, staff, and faculty? What's the impact of diverse students, staff, and faculty, and what assumptions are made when establishing or modifying those practices? Think about that, and just think about in your work area, when you make changes, how that impact what you're doing. Your coworkers, yourself, the students that you're serving, the community. The community is always looking at what we're doing in the education. And they're quick to criticize versus willing to come in and be part of the solution. So, strategies. This comes from Bowman, Karen Doss Bowman. Strategies for countering unconscious bias in the classroom, recognizing unconscious bias examples. So a professor calling on certain students more frequently. The reading and multimedia materials chosen for any given lesson not representing or reflective of the diversity in the classroom. Okay? I mentioned in the early years working with NC Real. NC Real was North Carolina Rural Entrepreneurship Through Action Learning. It was and is Sequoia Fund now owns the copyright. It's a wonderful curriculum. However, it was not a diverse curriculum in terms of the language and the examples in it. The early days of that curriculum being written was a group of people in Haywood County locking themselves into a hotel room and writing curriculum. And so it talked about campsites and some of the terminology, some of the names of people weren't reflective of a curriculum that then went nationwide. Okay? It was an organization that started at the state level in North Carolina that then became throughout the country. North Carolina at one point was the only state that it was funded by state legislators, okay? But it wasn't reflected. And so now that Sequoia Fund owns it, they're going back and they're trying to make it more reflective of the first people, Native Americans, etc. And so we got to be intentional. A presumption that international students have experts and interests in issues related to race, ethnicity, or home country, where we're asking them to give us examples from, well, how did you do it in your country? A lot of times they look at you like, this is my country. My parents may have immigrated from wherever, but I don't know. Okay? Or a student that has a Hispanic last name, and we just assume they know how to speak Spanish. In most cases, they don't. A tendency to lower proficiency in spoken English, to equate lower proficiency in spoken English with poor writing skills. That doesn't necessarily align, but those are some of the assumptions that we might make. So she goes on to say there are strategies that we have to really look at. We have to get real. And she said embrace that discomfort, to have those conversations, Spend time with people who are not like yourself. A lot of times we don't do that. Now, and a challenge may be, particularly at the community college level, we're overworked. Think about the number of hours that we put in. And now we're asking people to go out into the community and volunteer and do service hours and get to know people that don't look like you. That can be a very difficult thing to do. Apply intercultural communication techniques and be the change that you want. So the intercultural communication technique, I thought this was really good. Start with inquiry. Ask questions to understand more deeply another person's beliefs, or ask ourselves how we learn to think in a certain way. Where did that come from? What's that foundation? I know that I drive my friends crazy because of the type of work that I do. I'm quick to say, no, you didn't mean that to sound the way it did, but that sounds like ... Or I'll have a friend that will say, well, I hope you're not offended. And I'll say, oh, if you got to start with that, don't finish it, because more than likely I'm going to be offended. Or they will start to tell a joke about a woman or somebody else, another category of people, and I'll say, you know, that makes me wonder if when I walk away, you'll turn around and tell a joke about me. And so we have to get where we start thinking about how do we have that mindset that we have? Where did that come from? And how do we start changing that? And it can be very unconscious, and it can be uncomfortable to have those discussions. Framing, look at issues from a different perspective, looking at it from different points of view. Well, if I wasn't a male of a darker pigmentation, how would that impact me? How would I think about it? What access would that give me? And I have a good friend, white male, that I worked with for about 8 years on another college campus. And he asked me one day, he said, you do a lot of these trainings, but I think things have changed. And I said, okay, well, we have lunch quite a bit. And I said, I want you to just observe how we're treated when we show up in a restaurant together. And I said, and we're not taking the same car. We're going to take a different car. And I want you to be there before I get there. And so we were at this we started to this restaurant. He was standing out front waiting for me. And I started walking to the door. There was a car parked right up front, and the lady in the car locked the car door as I walked by. And when I got to the door, my friend said, did she just lock her car door? And I said, I'm used to that. That's normal. He was like, really? Just because you walked by? I said, no, it's because I'm a male of a darker pigmentation that I walked by, and she felt threatened, so she locked the door. I said, that happens all the time. I've had people cross the road, the sidewalk, as I'm walking down. And he was like, isn't that offensive? I said, if I got offended every time that happened, my stress level would be out the door. And then we get in the restaurant, and we ordered, and he said, why are people looking around at us? I said, they're trying to figure out the relationship. Why this black male and this white male are sitting here, and we're in professional attire. They want to know who we are, what we're doing. And then we both paid by credit cards, and he was like, they act like they didn't want to take your credit card. It's like, happens all the time. And so when we started framing it, he told me one day, he said, you have ruined every meal that I have had now. He said, because now I'm constantly looking around, observing how people are treated. And he said, and then I started realizing how they were treating my wife. He said, we went to the store, and we were buying something, and she was paying for it. She wanted it, but they kept addressing the questions to me instead of her. He said, I finally said, she got her own money. She buying this, so you better be talking to her. He said, you've opened my eyes to things that I just took for granted that I didn't notice. And we do that a lot of times. So the intercultural communication technique says, start looking around, frame it. And then position, consider the access to power in every situation that you have. What's the power base that you're bringing, and what does that look like? It goes on to say, then we started having dialogue. So that's what we're doing today. We're having that dialogue, and then reflect on it. Think about what it meant and what it looks like and how it impacts our coworkers, our students, the people from the community, and what action are we going to take to correct that. Now, you mentioned working in marketing. I know I drove our marketing people crazy. They would come down once a year to take pictures of the classroom for brochures and stuff, and I'll say, nope, this is not reflective of the community. Come back for this particular class because it looks more diverse. This one has too many men in it. This one looks too white. This one looks too black. And they're like, how did we get it right? I'm like, well, we got to be intentional. We got to look at who is it we're trying to attract to our campus, and what really puts our best outward facing on that says this is what we do, this is what we believe in, this is what we live. So this is a site where you can get her full study, Association of International Educators. If we're talking about hiring, because it does have an impact on our student population. I had a student, when I worked in Hayward Community College, I had a student come up to me towards the end of my tenure there, and I didn't know her. She walked up to me and she said, I want you to know that I came to this campus because I saw you. Black female. And I'm thinking, she is not in my program. Who is this lady? She said, oh, I'm in criminal justice. She said, but my parents and I drove through the campus on a Friday afternoon. Well, first of all, Friday afternoon, most faculty are gone. I was still there. And she said, and I saw you walk across campus. Didn't know you, didn't know what you taught, but I figured if you were here, it was safe for me to come here. Think about that. So even in our hiring practices, it has an implication. Onboarding practices. Within our onboarding, are we telling people what our expectations are around DEIB? Is it reflected in our mission statement? Is it reflected in our vision statement? Do we live it? Do we live it? If we're in student services and we are planning our fall fling, bash, whatever you call it, are we intentional around diverse food that is inclusive of vegans and people that don't eat pork, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Are we inclusive within our music or entertainment that we are providing? How strategic and intentional are we being? And that creates the culture. Enrollment, what's our process in terms of access? Our academic policies. Have we really taken a look at those academic policies and say, okay, how inclusive are they? Or are these the same policies that we had 50 years ago when our campus looked much different? How does that reach our syllabi? Are they culturally sensitive? Meaning that you really are intentional about what you have on your course syllabi, your relevance, the links to different things that they need, FAFSA completion, etc. And then looking at our disciplinary policies and procedures. So when we try to foster an environment of belonging, and again, that's what we want for everybody. We want everybody to feel a part of the campus. We start by looking at inclusion and the perspective, thoughts, and ideas of all individuals matter. That everybody is valued. Everybody shows up in their authentic self. We look at diversity, the multiple identities that's within our organization. And then equity, the constant and consistent recognizing and redirecting power. Understanding that we have power as Blue Ridge Community College employees, as employees. And there's a certain perception that comes with it. I used to tell my students, hey, I've been where you are now. Just because I'm teaching now or I'm a department chair doesn't mean I don't understand your stress level, your anxiety from day one. So, and I used to say to my students, day one, you all have an A. What you do to keep that A is on you. But you all have an A from day one. At the end of class, my saying was, have a good day and a better tomorrow. Wanted them to walk out of the environment feeling good about themselves, feeling good about the campus, seeing people that took time to talk to them and to get to know them. I tell a lot of personal stories about growing up and my siblings and I, not only in workshops, but when I was a teacher, to make that personal connection with them so that they don't see us and them and they feel comfortable stopping by your office or calling you. And you may be busy, and that's fine. I've said to students, I can't talk to you right now, but let's schedule a time when I can give you my undivided attention. Strategic and intentional. So determinants of inclusion and belonging. What's the connection they're making to the college? What does the community say about the college and the college standing? Connection to staff and faculty is a determinant. Now, with all of these, you're going to have to figure out, how do you even get that data? How do you measure whether or not people feel connected to the organization? Employee surveys is a good way to start. What's your attitude as an employee? Okay. What are you saying about where you work to the people in the community or the people you meet at the grocery store? Connection to faculty and staff, connection to college processes. Do people understand them? Do they know where to find them? Do they know how to tap in to those procedures? Connections to other like them. Okay? And again, them, connections, variance, differences. You define that as an organization. A consultant shouldn't come in and tell you what that is, because that's only their point of view. It should be the work that you're putting in through your professional development within your divisions, within your departments, to say, these are the outcomes that we want. These are the changes we need to make. This is what that looked like. This is how we involve the community. This is how we involve coworkers in the decision making. This is how we involve students in the decision making. Perception of fairness. Again, that's one that's really difficult to measure. But ask students, what do you like about Blue Ridge? What do you dislike? What can we change? How can we make this better? Now, put the other hat on. Think about your coworkers, particularly if you're in a supervisory role. What do you like about working here? What would you change? If you were in leadership, what's the #1 priority that you would look at this year? What do we need to do to retain you? I taught at full-time, I think 5 different colleges, okay? Not once when I resigned from a place did they say, what do we need to do to keep you? Not once. Think about that. But we want that sense of belonging. Perception of belonging, perception of respect and dignity. And that one is as simple as just returning calls and emails. That's my pet peeve. And don't hit reply to all. Okay? If it's a conversation that you need to have with one person that's on the chain, or you're saying, yeah, I can come, everybody else don't need to know. The person that organized it needs to know. That's my pet peeve. And perception to cultural proficient college services. Do we understand our folks that work there? Do we understand our student population? And again, I don't know your demographics here. I didn't dig that deep. You know, if you engage me to do more work, I would. But I suspect it's going to be really around socioeconomics, you know, and gender, and probably because of where you are situated, documented and undocumented students. I think that's probably, just if I had to guess, that's where your biggest gains can be made. And so a piece of that is, we defined microaggression earlier. And so there are different categories of microaggressions. Some are conscious, some are unconscious. And so when we talk about microassaults, they are conscious. People are intending to make that dig and to put that knife in there and turn it and twist it. It's intentional. Okay? You see that a lot with gender-based. Or it can be geographic, from county to county. Well, you're not from around here. You don't know how we do it. Okay? But it's conscious, it's intended, it's purposeful, intended, while micro insults may not be conscious. They may not be intended. They are usually based on ascription or belief of intelligence, of what we think people can do and cannot. It may be assumption of criminal status or treating people like second-class citizens. But a lot of times that piece is unconscious based on what we have been taught about that group of people. And so automatically, as the video says, within seconds, we make assumptions about people. I remember when I started teaching in Haywood County, the first day I was there, I asked my students, all 5 classes, what do you all think about me? I'm new here. What assumptions do you have? The one that I got the most was, you're going to be hard. And I said, why? Because you're wearing a suit. Most of our instructors don't wear a suit. And I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'm seeing some nods, so probably some Haywood County people, okay? Not to pick on Haywood County, but it was a different culture. Particularly, I think I went there after working in Spartanburg Tech, which the campus, the main campus, is right off of 85, and we used to call that the international stretch because of all of the international companies that were there. And so I was used to working with students in Phi Beta Lambda and other groups where we took them, you know, to state and national competitions. It was nothing to jump on the plane and fly to California. Got to Haywood County and had to beg students to go to competitions. Had to bribe them. The first time we took, I think I took 5 students, finally got them to go. One said to me, I don't know, I have to get permission from my husband to go. All 5 had never been out of the state of North Carolina. 4 of them had never been out of Haywood County. 1 had come to Buncombe County to go to the Mission Hospital for a specialized test that she couldn't get him in Haywood County. All 5 had never been in a cab. All 5 had never been on a plane. All 5 had never been on an elevator. Talking about cultural shock for them. It was really, and microaggressions in the cab driver kept asking them questions, and I finally said to them, stop talking. Why? I said, because he's making fun of your accent. He wanted to hear them talk. And they were, oh, look at that building. Look how high it is. Look at that bridge. Because they hadn't never been out of the county. And so a lot of it may be unconscious. And then we have micro-invalidations where we are trying to negate what people are feeling. Okay? I was doing a workshop similar to this, and I was given an example. The example I gave was when I was working in Asheville, a lot of times I would run to the mall. If I ran to the mall during lunch, I was dressed like this. And I was treated a certain way. But if it was the weekend and I've been working out and I got my gym clothes on, I got my baseball cap on, I'm a hat person, you see my hat right there, I got treated differently. And this one lady said, that happened to me. I said, well, tell me about it. When did it happen? Well, once I was in belts, and they followed me around. I said, oh, once, right? I said, this happens all the time to me. And I said, by chance, did you have a large purse? I said, I have 2 sisters, and they take these purses that they have everything but the kitchen sink in it. And I said, sometimes I think the kitchen sink is in there. Storytelling, fun. And she was like, well, yeah. I said, so you fit a profile. I said, but I can't change that profile. You can change the purse that you take when you go into the mall. I can't change my skin color. And she looked at me like, and she pondered it, and she crossed her hands, her arms, and I could tell she was really trying to think of a comeback. And she did that the whole workshop. And afterwards, she came up to me and she said, that had happened to me. And I said, yeah, but what you're doing is you're negating my experience. Your experience is different from my experience. Doesn't make it right or wrong, it's just different. And I said, so what we want to do is we want to understand that people have different experiences and they perceive that differently based on who they are and things that happen to them on a routine basis. And I said, and you may have been profiled for a number of reasons. You may have looked like somebody that, based on their experience, have shoplifted in that store before. I said, but what I won't do is negate your feelings, and I don't want you to negate my feelings. And so we can agree to disagree on the situation. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't stand here and talk with you. I've got to go. Because she wanted to continue that conversation, and I wasn't going there. So our action steps. List 3 to 5 things you can do to make your work environment more inclusive for students, staff, and faculty. You don't have to do it right now, okay? But I want you to think about that. What's 3 to 5 things you can do to make your work environment, whatever your office, your area, your influence, your area of influence, to make it more inclusive? And then go to YouTube. This is one that I like, this particular YouTube. You don't have to watch this particular video if you don't want to. But it's how to go beyond diversity and inclusion to community and belonging. Okay? How to go beyond diversity and inclusion to community and belonging. And then ask yourself, what does it mean to be part of a community? What does that look like? How does it make you feel? What communities are you connected to? And think about that. What communities are you connected to? I wanted to leave you with some examples of some initiatives. This is from Cornell University. They create intentional connections. They bring people together and can provide an environment where people feel they belong. This is one of the things they say on their website, that they are intentional about bringing people together. They go on to say they help build trusting relationships. They think about having a formal or informal mentoring program. First of all, I don't like the term mentoring. Why? Why not? What's wrong with the term mentoring? Got men in it. That's not where I was going, but okay. That's worth a chocolate bar. What else?
The mentor is more important or valuable than the person that they're
Yeah, it's creating that sense of us and them, that as a mentor, you know more. You know more than your mentee. So I'm actually doing a mentoring program per se with a college right now with students. And we're calling it life coaching. And we're talking about the challenges they have in their life as a student. What do those look like? What's the support they have from family, friends, and community? What's their goals? This particular student I worked with before I came down today, it's in pre-engineering, wants to transfer. So what does that look like? What classes do you need to be taking? What's the grades you need to be making to get those grades to transfer? How do you study? What's your next? But it's the same thing, but it's taking that perception of you know more than them out of the mentoring. But this is what the term that they use. Invite opinions and perception into the communication. Ask for input and ideas from all members, and then engage in purposeful storytelling. A lot of times I will tell stories in my training, and it's to share with people that may not even think about the experience. So, most people look at me and they see a professional person. When I lived in Charlotte, I had come from teaching one evening, and where I lived, there was a Harris Teeter on the corner. And so Friday evening, parking was horrible. So I would park in my assigned parking space, walk across the street to Harris Teeter, get what I was going to buy, and then walk back. So one day I'm walking back from Harris Teeter, and I see this patrol car coming up the road. I don't think anything of it. I'm walking. I didn't jaywalk. I went into the light. I'm a rule follower. So I went into the light change, came across and I noticed he slowed up as he got close to me, but I still kept walking. So then he pulls his car up on the sidewalk and blocks me. I have a suit and tie on. It was during the winter. I had an overcoat on. I had my little tam on. And he jumped out of the car and he said, "I need to see ID." Went right into my facilitation skills. Well, good evening, officer. How are you today? I need to see ID. The louder he got, the softer I got. And the more open I got. I said, what seemed to be the problem? I said, because I didn't jaywalk, did I? Well, we had break-ins in this area. I said, well, that's good to know because I live right there. And I said, and I don't think I'm dressed to crawl through somebody's window. And he looked at me like, that was the first time he saw beyond skin tone. And I said, but the real crime is what they're charging over there in Harris Teeter. And I kind of held my bags up. And he's, oh, okay. And I'm sorry. And he quickly, I was like, wait a minute, what's your name? And he was quick to get in that car and leave. But again, the storytelling, unless you have experienced that, that's not your reality. Okay? And then how you respond to that, so like with this life coaching that I'm doing, I'm trying to teach these guys how to respond so that they're not thrown down on the ground and their hands put behind their back. And I'm like, comply, be cordial, get softer with your tone, and then go back and sue. You know, and you got their attention now. Sue? Oh, I could get some money? Well, yeah, go to jail or sue. So, perfect intention. So, recommended next steps. A lot of times I tell people to do your own internal DEIB audit. To think about where are we and where do we want to be in creating a sense of belonging for all. For all. Whatever that looks like on your campus. Establish your DEIB benchmarks, your key performance indicators. How do you know you're making progress? How do you close that loop around? We want everybody to feel comfortable here. Develop DEIB strategies that enhance the organizational climate. Pay special attention to inclusive recruitment, hiring, orientation, socialization. Socialization and socializing, not just hiring people, but assigning somebody to that person where they know, they tour the campus, they know where everything's at, they know where to go eat. Again, not picking on Haywood County, these are all real stories. I said to my students the first week, I said, okay, I've been here a week. Where do you all go eat for lunch? Pioneer. I'm like, I already eaten there 3 times this week. And this is back in the day when you could smoke in the building, so I'm, again, aging myself. I was like, and I come out, I smell like smoke, my eyes are burning, I'm not going back there. The food is good, but I'm not going back. I said, what about Waynesville? We don't go to Waynesville. I said, if your car broke down between Waynesville and Canton, you could walk. Or Clyde. I said, you could walk. And they're like, oh, we don't go there. Okay? So when you're thinking about this, connecting your new hires with people that can show them around. Now, I remember when I was hired at Haywood Community College, they had a very intentional program. They assigned somebody for, well, that was my buddy. I felt like it was the Mormons indoctrinating me because every time I turned around, he was there. What do you need? What do you need? Where do you want to go to lunch? And he did that for the first month or two, you know. But I felt welcome, particularly since I lived in Charlotte and was driving back and forth to Statesville and really didn't know the community, didn't know people. And so he introduced me to people, etc. Inclusive student recruitment and retention practices. What are your practices? Where do you advertise your marketing information to students? How do you connect with community leaders? How do you partner with people? Inclusive operational practices, inclusive customer services practice, and then particular DEIB, marketing and public relations. What's the message that you're trying to create? What's the messaging? What does it say when people read your website? Educators are horrible. Well, not just educators, but all professions are horrible about using acronyms and jargon. And we tend to do it so normally that we use it when we're trying to recruit people. They don't have a clue what we're talking about. I've been consulting with this P20 council in this area, Blue Ridge, as part of the membership for the last 3 years. And I was talking to our executive director last week, and she said, I want you to proofread this. So I said, well, I'm going to proofread it from the equity lens, not from grammar. And you're going to have to get an English person to do that. But I was reading it, and she kept talking about LEAs. Now, I've been consulting with this group for 3 years, so I knew what a LEA was, local educational attainment. I said, okay, but if this is going out to the public, are they going to know what you mean by that? Oh, good call, good catch. I said, you got to be more intentional, particularly if you're trying to bring in stakeholders to look at educational attainment, and particularly for the 2 community colleges that are involved. It's got to be, I said, don't say FAFSA, tell them this free application for financial aid. You know, being very specific and not making assumptions. Identify appropriate messaging channels. Where are people getting their messaging about your college, about what you do? And then applying the equity lens to that. So I'll give you some examples. Arizona State University does a really good job with their inclusion efforts. University of Connecticut does a really good job. University of Denver Center for Multicultural Engagement and Inclusion. U.S. Davis, San Jose State University. All of those are really good sources of getting you to your next level of where you want to go. And then some resources, comprehensive guide about types of educational biases, 7 types of bias teachers are vulnerable to, strategies. We talked a little bit about Bozeman research there.